I request Gajanan Gupta Garu and Srivatsav Garu. A small interesting thing is Suresh Reddy Garu, Sai Deepak Garu is the third honorary member of our club, sir. We are very honored to have you as our honorary member, sir. Now I request Rotarian Manikantan Garu to introduce the guest as per the formality because no one here needs his introduction. Thank you.
Mobile on silent mode for the next 45 minutes. 1 hour, sir? Wonderful. How do I start my introduction? From a mechanical engineer from IIT or... how do I start the introduction? It's very tough to give you an introduction actually. A mechanical engineer turned an advocate and whatnot. Okay. Is basically Delhi-based first generation lawyer, an engineer turned litigator, an arguing counsel before the Delhi High Court and the Supreme Court. The Hyderabad-born engineer and IIT Kharagpur educated lawyer is very successful litigator, but did not have the law as his first career. Probably that happened to be the first now actually. And you are more popular in that line in fact. Instead, he graduated with a bachelor's in mechanical engineering from Anna University, after which he went on to pursue LLB. He handled a variety of matters relating to general civil commercial litigation, intellectual property litigations, competitions law, indirect taxation, information technology, consumer protection law, drug regulatory laws, whatnot. I think probably we need to sit with him a day or two to understand what are the laws that he has studied. With more focus on civil commercial litigation and constitutional litigation. As a law student, I think probably he started his practice at the age of 16, if I'm not wrong. 23, probably. And his blogs, I think he's having blog post on the Bajaj TVS patent dispute was quoted and was relied upon by a division bench of Madras High Court to reverse the finding of the single judge. He has also authored papers in various exemplary journals. He is also an honorary advisor for the Ministry of Commerce for the implementation of national IPR policy. He is well known for his argument on Sabarimala. Probably now it's a talk in every newspaper and social media and media. And Ram Janmabhoomi, probably that will be there for another decade also. Rohingya, illegal immigration issue, and on his submission are highly appreciated by the benches. He is a panel member for discussion on various issues on Rajya Sabha. Probably he will talk on different subjects. Probably we will try to understand and probably we'll get enlightened on this Sunday. I am sure all youngsters are here and you will have one more fan club from this club also. So let's put our hands together, ladies and gentlemen, here for a wonderful speech that is ahead. Thank you.
Good morning. Am I audible? Yes, okay. I just want to understand the age profile here. So how many people do we have here in the age bracket of 18 to 25? Wow, that's great. Great. So, first of all, I'd like to thank all branches of Hyderabad and Secunderabad's Rotary Club for giving me this opportunity. I'm indeed honored. It's a privilege that I'm getting this wonderful audience to interact with. Kindly don't think of this as a talk or a lecture. On a Sunday, that's the last thing that anybody wants to listen to. So I'll try and keep this as interactive as possible. And there'll be questions. Of course, you can have an extensive Q&A session at the end of the discussion. But I'll try and engage the audience as much as possible during the course of my talk. The topic or the title that's been given is the need for an Indic Renaissance. It sounds very boring. It sounds extremely philosophical. And it seems as if the topic is flying at 60,000 feet. I'll try and keep it as grounded as possible because at the end of the day, if a certain idea does not have a mass reach, it will never find traction. So one or two things, let me just give a few lines of introduction about me, not for the purposes of self-edification, but why is it that I have chosen this particular issue as one of the purposes of my own life. Is something that I want to share with people. So I'm basically from Hyderabad. I've lived here for about 16 years, and the rest of the 16 years I've spent outside of this city, in Tamil Nadu, in Bengal, and now in Delhi. I've lived in Delhi for the last 9 years now, over 9 years in fact. And the one thing that I realized over a point of time is that the level of deracination that has happened, at least in people of my age group and the subsequent generations, was unimaginable. It is immeasurable. And what do I mean by deracination? Deracination, according to me, is the complete cutting off of people from their own roots, systematic alienation from their own roots, either through education, external influence, or whatever you call it. And as someone, I'm not a religious person. I can't call myself a religious person. I'm not particularly devout. I don't go to temples frequently. I don't participate in religious rituals. Not that I'm an atheist. It's just that I'm not irreligious either. It's just that I perhaps don't have the interest or the inclination. But thanks to my upbringing, I would certainly call myself as someone who is cultural. I see a lot of value in culture. I see a lot of value in holding on to your roots to some extent, because that is what gives you your identity. So at some stage during the course of my engineering days, I asked myself the simple question: do I want to be one of those engineers who's slogging away for the rest of his life? I respect engineers, there's no doubting it at all. But I chose this particular profession for the simple reason that I thought I had a specific set of skills which I could put to better use if I were to make that switch from engineering to law. And thankfully, that decision has paid off over the last 10 years. I did my engineering from 2002 to 2006 and law from 2006 to 2009. I've been practicing for close to a decade now. And so far, I've not regretted having made that switch. I wake up each morning thanking God for having put the thought in my head that I should make that switch. Now, when it comes to Indic Renaissance, let me try and break this topic down in the most simple terms possible. One of the pet peeves that I have chosen for myself over the last few years is to free temples from government control. Most people assume that this is an elitist cause. I'm known for making outspoken statements, I'm known for making candid statements, so if it makes you uncomfortable, please suffer it and please bear with me. Most people assume that the cause of the temple is effectively the cause of the Brahmin, or it is the cause of one caste or one community. As far as I'm concerned, that institution belongs to everyone who falls within the Hindu fold. And therefore, if you're trying to free temples from government control, you're not fighting the cause of one particular caste or community, but you're fighting the cause for an entire faith, for an entire value system, for a group of communities, so to speak. Because if you try and understand Hinduism or Sanatan Dharma through the prism of, let's say, Abrahamic religions, you will fail for the simple reason this has got no comparison. This has got absolutely no benchmark. This is a very different system altogether. We are a bunch of schools of thought. So I'll give you a simple example. So I was just given a tour of this place, and I had a discussion with the members who run this place. And I asked them, why is this institution named the Vaishya hostel, or why is this hostel dedicated only to members from the Vaishya community? I really loved the answer, which is to say that if we open this up to every community, then our ability to control or have a say in how this institution is run is perhaps diluted. And therefore, we have chosen to ensure that people from our community are taken care of. To most people of this generation who do not understand how India works on the ground, this would come across as narrow-minded. But to most people who understand what the essence of India is, this is how India has always functioned. People looking out for each other within the same community. How many of you are aware of the fact that temple at one point of time used to be the institution for lending money, used to function as a bank? that trade guilds were established from within temples. So, as far as I'm concerned, it is important to reinforce the centrality of this institution called temple in the lives of people. Not to make them religious, but to at least make them cultural to some extent. How is this connected to the broad issue that's going on in today's scenario? The Sabarimala case, as far as I'm concerned, is perhaps the encroachment of the state, not just in the secular aspects of the administration of the temple, but now the state is also interfering with the religious aspects of the temple. Think of it on these lines. Tomorrow, the government decides that Arya Vaishya hostel or this particular community does not have the right to have separate hostels for girls and boys because that is discrimination, and therefore they decide that notwithstanding the fact that this is a privately run institution, we will tell you how you're supposed to run your place and in what manner boys and girls will study together. Would that be acceptable to you as far as this particular institution is concerned? If it is not acceptable to you when it comes to a private institution such as this hostel which is run by a certain community, how are we so comfortable with the state interfering with our temples? How is the example any different? How is the situation any different? India is a secular country. Is that the assumption? Yes or no? How many of you believe that India is a secular country? At least on paper. If it is a secular institution, if it is a secular country, therefore the state is supposed to maintain a distance from religious institutions. Yes or no? Yes. If that is the answer, isn't the state supposed to maintain a distance from all religious institutions? Yes. Therefore, the amount of control that the state exercises over religious institutions of different faiths must be at least similar or the same? Yes. Do you have an endowments board for mosques? Do you have an endowments ministry for churches? Do you have an endowments ministry for gurudwaras? Do you have an endowments ministry for synagogues in this country? Then why do you have an endowments ministry for only Hindu religious institutions? By having a dedicated ministry that chooses to exercise control over the religious institutions of only one faith, either you're violating the concept of secularism after claiming for yourself this concept called secularism, that you're a secular country, or while you call yourself a secular country, you operate like a Hindu state, because a state that interferes with Hindu institutions can only do so if it believes that it is Hindu in character. These are the only two options available to you. So either embrace your Hindu character and yet treat everybody equally, or remain true to the concept of secularism and stay equidistant from all institutions. If you choose to straddle on both the boats, you don't do justice to either of the boats. That is the simple concept. When you ask for freedom of Hindu religious institutions from state control, you're not making a statement against any other community. You're not attacking any other faith. You're only attacking the state for its hypocrisy. Ask any member of my generation, or perhaps this age bracket of 18 to 25, and you ask them, what is it about a temple that you hate the most? The one thing that comes out automatically as an instinctive response or an intuitive response, you have to pay money for some of these queues. Why do I have to pay money to have access to the deity? Why do you have these special lines? Why do you have these special queues? But then you ask them, so who has imposed this structure? Who has imposed this rule? Most people won't even be aware of the fact that it is the state which has imposed payment-based queue system across the board in all temples. So if you go to some of the popular temples in Tamil Nadu, Today, a payment-based queue system has gone to the extent where if you need a special darshan, you need to pay close to 2,000 rupees, 3,000 rupees, or 5,000 rupees. Are you aware of this temple called the Subramania Swami temple in Tiruchendur? Very popular. It's on the beach. From 500 rupees to 700 rupees, now the special queue system has gone to 1,000, 2,000, and 3,000. The community is rebelling, but the state continues to impose that particular structure. But who takes the blame for this? The community takes the blame, and the institution takes the blame for being money-minded. How is this connected to the concept of Indic Renaissance? The temple, at the end of the day, is more than a religious institution in the life of an average Hindu. Have you ever wondered why is it that this institution and communities associated with this institution have been the subject of repetitive attacks whenever there's been an invasion or whenever there have been attempts at conversions? Because at least to the person who is a non-Hindu, he has identified that this is the institution that plays a central role in the lives of an average Hindu. So if you choose to go after this nerve center, if you choose to go after this particular institution that plays a vital role, it is bound to have a domino effect on the community. The strategy as far as India is concerned has been no different from the African experience. That's been the same experience there as well. Demonize indigenous traditions. Call them the devil. Call them the Satan. Shame them when it comes to their traditions and beliefs. And when the cup is empty, and it has been emptied of local thought, you fill it with foreign thought. Please do not mistake me when I say this, that I respect any faith and every faith, so long as it does not say that it is my way or the highway. Because that particular institution or that particular concept is the single biggest reason for creating public disorder, for disharmony. As long as you say, you believe the way you wish to, you pray the way you wish to, and I will adopt my own faith and I will embrace my own faith, I don't think there is a problem at all. But when one chooses to impose his or her beliefs on the other, that's when the problem starts. Is this a controversial statement? Is this a perfectly reasonable and logical proposition to make? Can you coexist when one person believes that he necessarily has to convert the other for his own good? Or if he believes that as long as you do not adopt my faith, I will treat you as an inferior human being. The moment this thought takes seed or germinates in the mind of a youngster or in the mind of a child, and in formative years, you're constantly told that those who do not subscribe to your way of life are necessarily inferior. Can two people or two communities coexist? I'll go a step further. I'll go a step further and make this as uncomfortable as possible. Theoretically speaking, there is no concept of Brahmin by birth. At least that's not how the Hindu tradition functions. It is based on karma. It is perhaps based on guna karma characteristics. But unfortunately, today we subscribe to a notion that anyone who is born to a Brahmin parent is necessarily a Brahmin. Whether you follow that vocation, whether you satisfy the requirements of a Brahmin doesn't make a difference. Assume that a Brahmin assumes or believes that his way of life and his position is necessarily superior to the rest of the communities. Would it be acceptable to you? Yes or no? No. So why does it become acceptable and palatable when somebody else from a different faith takes the same position with respect to his faith and your faith? Because you don't want to offend his sentiments. Because you don't want to confront the reality. Because you have a problem accepting that there is a problem with that point of view. What applies to this thought or this style of thinking should equally apply to another form of thinking. Yes or no? Logic cannot be different in these two situations. Because if logic is different in these two situations, then there's a problem in which you perceive logic. what applies to the goose equally applies to the gander. So if one community cannot have a notion of superiority or supremacy within the fold, that is, let's call it intra-faith superiority, can you have interfaith superiority and still hope for coexistence and peaceful cohabitance? Is it possible? What happens when the state chooses to drive a wedge between two different communities by making one community the subject of exercise of its control, uses its resources in the name of secularism to feather everybody else's nest? These are questions which you have to ask. So the other day I was talking to my cousin, and who's very candid and outspoken. So I asked him, so he's doing his, he's completed his sports management degree. So I asked him what does he want to do, and I was having a discussion with him. And he had recently visited this temple in Karnataka, Gokarna temple. And when we asked him, do you know about the history of the temple? He gave us a fantastic exposition of the whole thing, and I was surprised. So I asked him, why did you even take an interest? So he said, I'm going to a place, I'd like to know what it is about. So I asked him in general, so do his friends call themselves spiritual but not religious? Do they call themselves atheists? Because on Facebook, this is a very popular status these days, spiritual but not religious. So I asked him, what do you think of all of this? So I heard an unusually mature opinion from him. Unusual because I didn't expect it to come from that age group. He said, no, most people actually have it only because it's cool. Apart from the fact that since their parents have not taken an interest in teaching them their own traditions, they have no clue as to where they come from and what their roots are. So they automatically subscribe to the comfortable notion of atheism as opposed to subscribing to something whose logic they don't understand. The point I'm trying to make is, one generation or two generations have already made the mistake of not passing on their traditions and roots to their children. If it continues at this rate, all in the name of liberalism, they'll do what they wish to do. I leave it entirely to their own devices. You will find a situation where 80% of this country has opened itself up to all sorts of influences from outside, good, bad, and ugly. And you will have absolutely no control over how the society changes subsequently. And there will come a point where you'll ask yourself, how did this come about? I'm 32. When I visited Sabarimala in 98, I was 13. I would have never guessed that in 20 years, I would face a situation where bursting firecrackers had become such a taboo, and Sabarimala would be the center of such an ugly controversy. In a span of 13 years, this is the change. Dahi Handi is out on its way. Firecrackers during Diwali is out on its way. God knows what else will find an exit option. This is the pace at which things have changed. Sabarimala, at the very least, has a recorded history of 300 years. At the very least. There are gazetteers and books written by Britishers where they've recorded that this is the practice that women who have attained puberty and who still are in the period of menarche cannot enter that particular institution, cannot enter the temple. So there is a recorded history of at least 300 years. So something which has survived for over 300 years stands set aside today by judicial intervention. In one fell swoop, it's gone. But we are trying to revive it. We'll see what can be done. But all I'm trying to tell you is the pace at which things are changing. Change is constant and change is good. That's what Bhagavad Gita says. But you have to decide whether it is change for the good or change for the worse. That's a question as a society you have to ask yourself. So whenever I discuss or give a talk on this topic, I'm asked, what can we do as people? What can we do? How do we contribute? It's not necessary for you to always think big. There are certain things that most people can do within their own circumstances, which is completely within their control. So I'm giving you three options. if you're running an institution or you're an entrepreneur, is it not possible for you to ensure that people who work for you are taken care of and they participate in your festivals and they're made to feel part of this system and this ecosystem and the Hindu fold? I'm talking of your Hindu employees at the very least. You don't need to impose your faith on anybody else. Is it not possible for you to ensure that when they're struggling for money, they don't go to some institution that says that I'm willing to offer you money provided you change your faith? Is that not within your control? When your house help needs money, or when your security guard needs money, or when your driver needs money, please realize he is in that vulnerable position where he has opened himself up for predatory proselytization and conversion. Because you're never in that shoes, you're never in that situation, you're never in that circumstance, it is easy for you to say, how can he convert for the sake of a few thousand rupees? For him it is important. This takes you to another angle. Only when temples choose to dedicate their resources for the benefit of the community and they invest in the community, they will strengthen the community from within. There is no point in blaming the outsider or someone who doesn't belong to your faith as long as there are weaknesses within your own community. You can blame the thief for having the intent of entering your house, but keeping your house open without a lock is your problem, it's your mistake. And it's your stupidity. So if you need resources to ensure that people are educated, that they don't struggle to provide at least basic education to their own children, you need resources. But your resources are in whose control? State control. And that is precisely why you need to free Hindu institutions from state control. So when somebody tells me this discussion on this topic is perhaps an elitist topic which is meant for the high-flying members of the society who sit in an air-conditioned room, they don't realize that the beneficiaries of this particular goal will ultimately be the middle-class Hindu, the low-middle-class Hindu, and Hindus who live below the poverty line. Tirupati with its resources, is it capable of not investing in free education, free basic education for members of the Hindu community, at least in Tirupati? Is it possible or not? It's possible. Then what stops it from investing those resources in them, in the community? When you know for a fact that conversion is on the rise in and around those districts, and money is a problem as far as people living in that particular area is concerned, is it not possible for this particular institution, which is supposed to be the richest temple in the world, or the richest religious institution in the world, to invest in the community? But does it have a say in who can use its resources? The institution has no say. Tirumala Tirupati Devasthanam had a separate act before 1987. Post 1987, when the HRC legislation of Andhra Pradesh was amended, pursuant to recommendations by Justice Challakondaya Committee, the TTD administration was merged with the HRC administration, and there is a specific chapter that deals with it. Anybody who thinks that this legislation is only meant to regulate and restrict and to ensure that there is no corruption fails to realize that wherever there is state, there is bound to be corruption. That is the reality. Are you telling me that state as an institution whose corruption is there for you to see on a daily basis in every newspaper is the single institution in which you will put your faith with respect to the resources of your community? Doesn't make sense at all. When tens and thousands of crores of rupees are involved, are you saying that the Indian state, regardless of whoever is in power, whichever party is in power, is capable of running that institution without corruption? Is that even possible? Yes or no? Then why is it that we don't take an active interest in reclaiming our own institutions? And this goes back to a fundamental problem. As long as you think of yourself as an individual, and as long as you think of yourself as an island who's untouched by the developments which are outside your control, this will be the problem. At some point, this community needs to make a decision, needs to take a stand. Will we be silent spectators to this rapid tide of change without even offering so much as a resistance, without even asking questions, without even holding people to account? The HRC legislation in its amended form in this state has been in force since 1987. Until 2012, when Swami Dayanand Saraswati chose to challenge it before the Supreme Court, nobody chose to challenge it. I asked myself this simple question. I was exposed to this issue only in 2015 December, and when I read the legislation and the kind of powers that are given to the state, I asked myself, why is it that nobody has deemed it fit to approach the court and say that this legislation needs to be struck down? And I'll explain in simple terms why. I'll again give the same Arya Vaishya hostel example. You call it the Vaishya hostel, therefore it is meant for a certain community. But if the state chooses to appoint people who shall be the trustees of the board, can you call it an independent institution? Is there a distinction between appointment and election? Yes or no? Election would mean community participation, yes or no? Appointment would mean zero community participation, yes or no? Your trustees are appointed, they are not elected. Trustees of every other institution, of every other faith are elected. The Gurudwara elects its own trustees. The Waqf elects its own trustees. The second largest owner of real estate in this country is the church. Please tell me, do you think it is impossible for any kind of corrupt dealings in the church when it comes to the kind of land it holds? Is it inconceivable? Yes or no? It is possible, right? Does the state choose to interfere with the activities of the church citing corruption? Then why is it that you choose to make an example only out of this community, as if corruption is peculiar only to this community? But whenever I ask this question, I have a few questions that come from the other side. What if the state leaves? Who will take care of our own institutions? So who is taking care of this institution? The state. Does the state conduct your Ganesh Chaturthi pandals and all that? Or even during Dashera? You have local communities which choose to pool in resources, which choose to hold their own festivals and their own functions. That is the innate spirit of this land. Self-reliance is the innate spirit of this land. License permit Raj is the invention of the Congress. But that's not the innate spirit of this country. So if you're capable of running or conducting these functions, is it not possible for the community to take care of its own institutions? The community can perhaps choose to say, we will also take care of members of other communities, but that is a decision that you will take based on your consent. It is not for the state to say, you give your money to this particular entity or this particular community. When under the BJP, which is supposed to be a party with a difference and all that, its chief minister directs the Shirdi temple or any other temple to earmark funds for the purposes of investment in hospitals and roads. Did he seek the permission of the community? So how is it that when it comes to these resources, it is everybody's money? I'm sorry if it sounds narrow, I'm sorry if it sounds parochial. I'm completely open to the resources of this community being used for everybody else's benefit, so long as their resources are also available for everybody else's benefit. The simple basis of the principle on the basis of which you operate is reciprocity. I will do to you what you will do to me. Is this unreasonable? Is this illogical? Am I saying something that is communal? Am I saying something that is fascist? Am I saying something that is bigoted? Logic is perhaps the better way to approach a proposition as opposed to emotion and rhetoric. So I'm merely testing the validity of my proposition on the basis of logic. I want parity in treatment. I want equality in treatment. The Supreme Court is so obsessed with equality these days. I'm asking for equality in treatment. Whether or not they understand the practice of that particular temple, they have chosen to impose equality in the most unequal manner possible, in the most discriminatory manner possible. I am asking for the same equality to be applied as far as this group of institutions are concerned. I'll give you a simple statistic. And I've discussed this in detail in multiple places, but I'll give you this statistic. There are close to 39,000 temples in the state of Tamil Nadu alone. And there are over 400 temples which have been notified by UNESCO as places of heritage, world heritage, global heritage. Out of these 39 temples, 38,265 temples are under government control. So is this the assumption that 38,265 temples require the presence of the state? And do you know what is the income of these places? Less than 10,000 a year. That is less than 800 rupees a month. What corruption are you talking of in an institution that can't even earn 800 rupees a month? What business does an executive officer or the state officer have in such an institution? Unfortunately, this community is in deep slumber. It has slept for long enough. God knows what is the reason for the slumber. We keep sleeping over and over again when it comes to these institutions. Since these questions have not been raised over the last 2 generations, people like me have had to step up. And since nobody has asked a question for the last 2 generations, that status quo has become acceptable. So when I ask these questions, I look like the idiot. Why is he asking these questions? Nobody is bothered to ask these questions. We are perfectly comfortable with the situation. What you don't realize is real estate means presence. Presence means visibility. Visibility means you exist. When you don't exist, when you're out of the public eye, you've effectively been relegated to the margins. As part of this trust called the Indic Collective Trust, we have recently filed a petition before the Andhra Pradesh High Court, or should I call it just the High Court, so that I don't get brickbats. God knows what will come my way. I'll just call it the High Court, which is common to both Andhra Pradesh and Telangana. I'll keep it that way. Asking for removal of non-Hindu employees from Tirumala Tirupati Devasthanam. Do you find it wrong if I say that only Hindu employees must work in Hindu institutions? There are close to 42 employees who are in every level of the institution. I am not saying only Hindu employees must work in state institutions, but at the very least I have a right to say in Hindu institutions only Hindus should work and they should benefit? Or would you use even secularism to say even that is a bigoted position? Is it possible for a Hindu to become a minority welfare minister? Is it possible for a Hindu who professes and practices the Hindu faith to become the head of a Waqf board? Do you have absolutely any say in how the bishop or the diocese chooses to deal with the property of the Christian community? If these basic questions are bigoted, and it is the Hindu who sees this position as bigoted, I pity him because he is digging his own grave or her own grave. Unfortunately, if I were to raise these questions before members of other communities, take it from me that I will find more acceptance from them, because then I will say, you interfere with me, I will interfere with you. So they will immediately say, you stay within your own territory. But it is the Hindu who will be the first person to object to my position. So there is no point in blaming anybody else. There is a problem with your indoctrination. There is a problem in the manner in which you've been brainwashed for generations. Don't blame the schools for their education, because then you're effectively saying that schools are responsible for upbringing. We're only responsible for conception and delivery. You've had the child, so the children are yours. They are not the wards of the state. So as far as teaching is concerned, don't limit it or exclusively to the schools. take an active interest in what is it that your child is learning. If textbooks are teaching nonsense and parents don't take an interest, they will assume that parents also endorse that nonsense. And if that brainwashing starts at this age, he will have absolutely no problems with anybody interfering with the Hindu state, with the Hindu institution. There are any number of Christians from Kerala who support the temple's practice of Sabrimala, who say that women should not enter because even men from their own families have gone to the temple and their women have taken an active interest in that particular practice. But it is Hindus from all over the world who are now asking for entry of women, citing equality. So there is only a point to which you can constantly blame others for your own mistakes, your own weakness, and your own inability to stand up for your traditions. But you can't stand up for your own traditions because you don't know your own traditions. As I said, the caveat is, I am not a religious person, but I see an intrinsic value in all of this. I see a value in all of this because all of this plays a role in the shaping of identity. Individual identity and societal identity and collective identity. So a lot of people have told me during the course of several discussions, the day caste as a factor dies, Hinduism and Hindus will unite and there will never be a problem again. What they don't seem to realize is, because this community does not have an organized central figure, and because it has multiple factions, so to speak, it is difficult for anybody to control this institution, and therefore it is difficult for anybody to impose their will on this institution because they will struggle. There will always be resistance from one part or the other, which is why conversions or invasions have not succeeded in completely converting this particular community. Respecting a certain identity which comes from a certain background is not the same as having a casteist mentality. I draw that distinction very clearly. I am of the clear view that if a machine has to work, all parts have to work together. Any part which thinks that it is superior to the other and says you're only the nut and you're only the bolt, remove the nut and the bolt and let's see if the machine works. That is how I see it. I don't claim to have any knowledge of the Shastras. I don't claim to have any knowledge of the Vedas. I'm not even trained in any of those. But my intuitive response or my intuitive understanding of the system is this. The people who will ask for destruction of the caste identity are the first people to cite caste identity whenever it is convenient. I will give you the example of the state of Tamil Nadu openly. The self-respect movement, the Dravidian movement, all of this was started on the basis that caste as a factor must die, must perish. Every year you will find any number of newspaper articles that report caste-based violence. So what has happened? Has this movement failed? Has your ideology failed? Or have you failed to understand this institution? Or have you failed to understand the basis of this institution? Indic Renaissance, in its most lucid terms, in perhaps the most simplest of terms possible, is an urge, a plea to each of you members to take an active interest in the affairs of your community, to take an active interest in your own traditions, and to make sure that you pass on the traditions that you have got, which is perhaps a fraction of what your parents had. At least that fraction must go to your children, at the very least. Does anybody in the audience know why do you burst crackers for Diwali? What is the connection? Any idea? Is it just a merry-making activity? Is it just a celebratory activity? Or is it just an activity for making money? Why do you burst crackers? What is the nexus? So here's the sequence. What comes before Diwali? You have the Shraddha period, the Mahalaya Paksh. Correct? Then you have Diwali. And then it comes the Kartika Masam, correct? Here's the understanding. And you will find parallels to this structure or to this tradition even in China. So what are you doing during the Shraddh period or during the Mahalaya Paksh period? The understanding is that your ancestors have come and you're supposed to feed them. That is what effectively you do. They've come. Now they have to go back. They don't know the way. You light the sky for them to find their way back to heavens. There is scripture after scripture after scripture that says that this is to be done. It's called Akasha Deepak. We had to cite all of the scripture before the Supreme Court because the Supreme Court, in just 8 lines without discussing any evidence, had taken a position that bursting of firecrackers during Diwali is a mere celebratory activity. It's a merry-making activity. It is not a ritual. I'm sorry, it is a ritual. You can regulate it. You can limit it. When you burn sparklers, do you think there is a word for it in Sanskrit, or do you think that sparklers did not exist when Sanskrit existed? So the word for it is Ulkadana. You will find references to it in a scripture called Kartika Mahatmyam. And in multiple documents they have recorded this over and over and over again. Britishers have written, Indians have written, our scriptures say so, but we don't know. If somebody had approached the Supreme Court representing the rights of the Hindu community and other communities, there are any number of variants for Diwali. The Sikhs actually celebrate it as the Bandi Chhod Divas. That has a specific history. The Jains have a specific variant. Is it a coincidence that all these communities celebrate Diwali in one way or the other around the same period of time? Surely it's not coincidence. There must be something common to all of this. So considering all of this, what does it tell you? Your ignorance with respect to your own traditions is going to be used against you to humiliate you, to shame you, to call you a patriarch, to call you a chauvinist, to call you whatnot, until a point comes where you would have decided to give up your identity altogether. Whatever is happening around you is not a struggle for resources, but it is a struggle for identity. Any number of people would say, but why is identity so important? Look at China, look at America. Then you have not understood their history. America believes in manifest destiny. It believes that it has a destiny to lord over the world, so to speak. That it has a destiny which facilitates pursuit of happiness. That is the identity they've imputed to themselves. China subscribes to the Middle Kingdom concept. What about India? What about India? We fail to realize the sheer privilege that we enjoy after generations of living in one unified territory from Himalayas to the south. This is something that even Chandragupta Maurya could not achieve, despite having a Chanakya by his side. This is something that Samudragupta could not achieve. This is something that even the Mughals could not achieve. As long as your identity exists, this entity exists in the way it exists. The day your identity is eviscerated and your identity is hijacked, India as it exists today, even as it exists today, despite all its flaws, will cease to exist. So Indic Renaissance is not the pastime of the upper middle class Hindu who has all the time in the world to sit and discuss dharma and karma, but this is at the end of the day a survival existential campaign, a struggle. I went to Israel recently from October 13th to the 20th. And I've given this example before. Just give me a few minutes and I'll complete this. think of the Israeli society as a society with concentric circles. At the core is the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community. The next ring is the Orthodox Jewish community. Then comes the conservative Jew. Imagine ultra-Orthodox, Orthodox, and then you have the conservative Jew. And then you have the secular Jew. And on the outer fringe is perhaps the atheists. But the one thing that I was surprised and astounded by is the shared sense of Jewish heritage and pride in Jewish heritage that each of these people have, regardless of which ring they are in. Can you say the same thing about a secular Hindu and a conservative Hindu as far as India is concerned? You will not be in a position to say this, because he is so far removed and his level of guilt is so high that he'll perhaps be the first person to spit on his own roots compared to the outsider, so to speak, or someone who's outside the faith. The sum and substance of my agitation or my plea to you is simply this. Do not treat any of these talks as pastimes. I am not here to deliver a Harikatha. I am asking you to take ownership of at least one initiative, something that you believe in, and throw your weight behind it. If you're interested in reviving a certain art form, please see how is it that you can contribute to it. At the very least, take an interest in the temple which is in your locality and ask yourself who is running it. What is the level of state interference in it? Where does the money in the hundi go? Ask these questions. These are basic questions. This is doable. Not one suggestion that I've given is unreasonable. It doesn't require a stretch of your resources or imagination. It only requires you to put your money where your mouth is. So the next time you choose to whine about dharma, or you choose to whine about your religion, or you choose to whine about how the Indian state is hypocritical or is discriminatory towards Hindus, just ask yourself, have you taken at least one step? Have you contributed at least one brick to changing the status quo? If you have done nothing, I must say this bluntly, you do not have the right to whine. Under Article 19 or Article 14 or Article 21 or any of the free speech rights, while you have the freedom to speak and the freedom to express, we have unfortunately translated it to freedom to whine endlessly. This has become the nature of our society. So at the very least, and this is something that I have to say, I'm sorry, perhaps it's my young blood talking. I think of myself as being young. Pardon me if you don't think so. But the point is this. Anyone who seems to be a person of resources rushes to an ashram for salvation, God knows for what reason. I have to put this point. I have to say this. I'm sorry if I'm offending a lot of people. I'm simply paraphrasing what Vivekananda has said. You do not have a right to seek individual salvation when the rest of your society is struggling. You have not arrived at a phase where each of you can start going towards salvation. Go to any number of ashrams, patronize any number of babas, no problem, but come back to the temple. Because no matter which baba comes and which baba goes, the temple has to remain, it shall remain, it is your responsibility to ensure that it remains for eternity. Put your faith in any number of people. I won't use this phrase called Godman because according to me that's wrong. No problem. But the source is the temple. The root is the temple. The Gangotri is the temple. All of them derive their knowledge only from the temple and from the knowledge that has come from the temple. So whether they attribute their knowledge and their success to the temple or not, at least you should know where they draw their knowledge from. So my request to you would be, perhaps one generation has to swallow this poison pill for the next generation to continue calling itself practitioners of the Sanatana Dharma. In a democracy, what happens is, it is meant to give you the freedom to pursue your own goals, your own, let's say, dreams. But it also, unfortunately, gives you the luxury of passing on your duty to the next generation. I can't do it, somebody else will do it. And As a consequence, what you have handed over as legacy to the next generation is a set of problems which only keeps growing by the day. A set of identity-related challenges which only keeps piling up by the day. So the hope is, at least in my generation, we'll reduce the burden for the next generation, if not eliminate it. Help us. Help us by helping yourself. Take an active interest in the people around you. I'm sure at the very least, you can influence 5 people in your circles. I'm not asking you to convert. I'm asking you to tell them what you stand for. If somebody spits against your faith or your community in front of you, the very least you can do is to speak up and stand up for your community, as opposed to keeping your mouth shut out of some misplaced sense of politeness. Politeness is not in keeping your mouth shut when somebody is spewing venom against your faith. It's as good or as bad as respecting a friendship where the friend is actually spitting at your parents and you don't want to hurt the friend's sentiments. It's as stupid as that. Are you going to choose your parents over your friends? That is the question that you have to ask yourself. This is the simplest example that I can at least offer for the so-called esoteric concept called Indic Renaissance. You call it whatever you want to. I simply call it rejuvenation of the dharmic spirit. Go back to the basics. Read Aurobindo. Read Swami Vivekananda. Read Madan Mohan Malviya. Read K.M. Munshi. Read Ambedkar. Do read him. I haven't found one intellectual in the last 60 years who comes anywhere close to his clarity of thought. He is one of the sterling individuals that we have produced. Whatever his angst may have been against certain scriptures, that was a product of the circumstances he was brought up in and the product of the circumstances he lived in. But remember, he never chose to convert outside the dharmic fold. He never chose to convert to any other faith despite all the incentives that were offered to him. He tried his best to ensure that caste discrimination and untouchability were reduced. And when he realized that he couldn't succeed, he went to the closest option available that allows him to remain within the fold, which is Buddhism. He did not convert to any other faith. So anybody who uses Ambedkar to divide this community is a motivated, useful idiot in the hands of those who have an agenda. He's useful for them and he's an idiot for me. So therefore he's a useful idiot. So my request to you would be, as opposed to offering sweets to each other on festive occasions, distribute books. Make sure that people are aware of their roots. Community participation or community celebration of festivals is important. Why do you think Sabarimala is under such intense attack? Any idea? That is the one place where, regardless of the background you come from, you bond, you're together, and you subscribe to one rigid sattvic practice. And when you go there, Sabarimala, if its tradition were to be hijacked or if it were to be destroyed, I can't think of any other religious institution within the Hindu fold which will survive a similar attack. Because that is one place where there is no caste identity. That is one place which is free of any unch neech kind of thought. And if that institution is attacked and that institution succumbs, what will survive next? You have to ask yourself, which is the institution that is on the radar next? So when you look at this institution or this issue, please do not limit it to this narrow question of gender equality or gender discrimination. It goes beyond that. As people who have preceptors like Adi Shankaracharya as your gurus, as our role models, the very least that you must develop over a point of time is the power of argumentation. But you need information before you argue. So try and equip yourself with as much information as possible. When your child asks you the reason for a certain practice, at least admit that you don't know and try to answer the question the next time he asks you the question. As opposed to saying this is some superstition. Merely because you know nothing, it can't be superstition. That is not the definition of superstition as far as I know it. So my request to you would be, if you can't think of the society, let's be Indians and be selfish. Think of yourself, think of your family, think of your children, and for their own sake, take an active interest in protecting your traditions. Thank you.